actually visited, I had a good friend in high school that we visited several different schools of nursing. And I ended up picking one that I financially could afford. I had saved about $500, and it cost me about $500 to go the 3 years to nurses training. The downside of that was we got every 12th weekend off. We worked every weekend, even in our specialty areas. We would work all day, and then we took call like an OB. We took call from 3 in the afternoon to 7 the next morning. We took call 3 in the afternoon to 7 the next morning in surgery. All night long, my 20th birthday, I scrubbed on a gunshot case. Handling back table, you know. I mean, we were trained to do everything a surgical nurse was to do. To get into nurses training, I had applied, we had all kinds of tests. And I actually think the reason that they, you know, I made pretty good grades, but there was quite a bit of competition to go to nurses training back then. But I had worked that summer in a nursing home there in Springfield, Missouri, on a young people's floor. And the patient, lots of young people under 30, for a variety of head injuries, different kinds of illnesses and problems. But the one that I remember the most was a gal that was in her 20s that had had polio in the 50s during the epidemics, that lived in iron lung and a rocking bed. And each patient that was a polio victim were evaluated by how well they could breathe and maintain their oxygen level on the rocking bed. And rocking beds were just where they constantly moved up and down. And by putting their head very low, all the abdominal organs would push the air out. And when we practically stood them up, then the abdominal organs dropped down and they would suck enough air in to breathe. We were assigned a lung when we went to work, and no matter what we were doing, back then the electricity was always going off. Storms, high winds. Then we had 3 minutes to get to that patient's room, put them back in the iron lung, seal the lung, and we pumped that lung with our foot, bellows, until the electricity came back on to keep them alive. I've seen a lot.
Mm-hmm.
School was, our whole first year we went to college, took college classes. I think we started with about 90 students, and I think we flunked out the first year 20 of the 90, or they quit, found it too difficult. You know, nobody asked questions. And the college was about 6 blocks. We walked back and forth, regardless of the weather. Very few had a car. And if they had a car, there were 10 people in it. But we had mandatory study hours every day from 7 in the evening until 10. Everybody had to be in. Normally, we worked usually 3 to 4 hours in the morning before we went to classes, and then 3 to 4 hours in the afternoon when we came back for classes, depending on when our classes ended, which kind of rotated to where they could cover the floors. And we worked just general duty on all the floors. Sundays, we had mandatory chapel at 5. You had to be dressed and ready to go to the floor. We had 30 minutes between chapel and to get to the floor duty for breakfast. And then we were able to sign up for pay. We'd do our 8-hour shift for the school, and then we could work 3 to 11s for pay. As freshmen, we made $8 a shift. As second-year students, we made $10 a shift. And as seniors, part of our training was being manager on a floor, and we got $12 a shift. So needless to say, we had lots of experience. Our hospital was a crippled children's hospital for about a 300-mile radius. So we had crippled children's clinics 5 days a week, each day a different, like cross eyes, club feet, all kinds of different congenital deformities there. And sometimes we'd see 200 or 300 kids in one day, which was And we got all the premature babies. The police would bring these tiny babies in from this radius, because so many of the hospitals didn't have facilities. And even us, a lot of times back then we could do very little to save these preemie babies. It's come a long way. Our labor and delivery, most of us, we always kept totals of how many deliveries we assisted with and like that. And most of us did between 120 and 150 deliveries in our rotational period in that area. We had our psych training in St. Louis at the State Sanitarium. And the hospital that year was the year of the Six-Day War. It was, everybody in Israel. So it was a very traumatic, and it was the height of Vietnam. So at that time, we were told when we started in St. Louis that the state of St. Louis, or state of Missouri at that time, had 10,000 psychiatric patients. And the hospital, we had 50-bed floors. They were divided not by diagnoses, but by male and female, and locked units and unlocked units. And the majority of the patients, the only locked units were patients that had committed crimes and were put into the hospital and had to be contained like a prison. And we weren't allowed to work on those floors because many of those patients were very dangerous. But no air conditioning. Missouri is very hot and very humid, 20-foot ceilings, 50-bed floors, and amazing. I would say we probably had 8 or 10 women that were not mentally ill, but that were brain damaged from eclampsia. When you're pregnant and you seizure, we didn't have the drugs back then to control. We didn't understand eclampsia back then. So we had women that were profoundly brain damaged from seizuring during delivery. It was funny, we got free tickets to take patients out to Muni Opera and to ball games and all kinds of stuff like that. And after hours and on weekends, and of course all of us were wide-eyed, won't they disappear, won't they run? And the nurses and the doctors would just laugh and say, they will stick like glue. And they did. You'd take 10 or 15 on the city buses. Now, you had two student nurses would take 10 or 15 patients on a city bus and go to these things with free tickets. And you'd get up to go to the bathroom, and all 15 were latched onto you. It was an experience. And of course, a lot of us were not big city girls. And the most interesting things, it was in a very old part of St. Louis, and on one side was all Jewish, which had this wonderful bagels and lox, and on the other side was Italian. So our greatest joy was going out in the neighborhood to eat. So it was a lot of fun. And we'd catch the bus on weekends to go back to our homes, a lot of us, because only time at school that we had weekends off. We only worked at the Psych Institute Monday through Friday. But we'd catch the bus and go through Fort Leonard Wood during Vietnam, and all the soldiers would get on the bus. So it was like being in another psychiatric facility on the bus on the way home. But it was quite an experience, Most of us, I think we ended up graduating 43 nurses. And that year, we all took state boards the week after we finished school in Jefferson City, Missouri, and all 43 of us passed and got our board, got our license, which was really exciting. We got married. We finished school the 5th of September, and we got married the 1st, which was a Sunday evening, only time I was off work. And no honeymoon. I worked nights the rest of that week. And Saturday and Sunday, my husband had actually had gotten drafted to go to Vietnam and had applied for vet school and had gotten in at vet school at 20. which is a miracle, you know. And so we moved, and we had taken out a loan. How did we ever get money to take out a loan? We pooled our money, and we bought a car, an old rattle-trap car, and we bought a trailer house. And it took us that whole weekend to clean it. We bought it from 5 guys that had been students at the University of Missouri. And I started a 50-bed surgical floor on Monday, and I took state boards that Thursday and Friday. And I worked on that surgical floor until I got my boards. And actually, I'd worked and had so much experience in nurses training. I worked a lot in ER and intensive care that I ended up working in intensive care the next 3.5 years while my husband was in vet school. We moved here. I had 2 kids in 2 years, and the year after our daughter was born, I went to work here for the hospital. Sharon Feller had started a brand new visiting nurse for Burton, Washington County, and I was the first nurse that she hired to cover Burton, Washington County. So I worked for her until '79. And here again, I'd always worked in the units and went back to work in the critical care at Methodist Hospital. Started out, my first job was in coronary. And actually, I think always my favorite was neuro and surgical intensive. But I worked open heart for 2 years, and then I went and spent the rest of my years in intensive care, working just regular intensive. I went back to school. Actually, I decided when my kids were in college and were graduating that I needed to finish my nursing degree. And at that time, Methodist was paying our tuition to go back and to get our degree. And I got a Bachelor of Science, graduated straight A's. And my best experience in going back to school was I did a practicum at the Salvation Army. The old Methodist Hospital had donated it to the Salvation Army, which is a phenomenal institution. And people have no idea what they offer to an indigent community, vital needs that so many people don't have. And I had planned to get my nurse practitioner, and I really wanted to work in a women's clinic because I do think women at that time didn't have the opportunities that they needed to manage their health care, especially single young women, birth control. All those issues were such an issue back then that have even improved now. And then I did a bunch of different kinds of nursing. I worked surgery for a while. I've been retired about 1.5 years, working in 6 different casual jobs, doing MRI and nuclear stress test and CAT scans, and I did outpatient infusion therapy. So I've had quite a diverse 50 years of nursing.
You really have. Thank you very much for all your memories. This is great.
We've come a long way, haven't we, Peggy?
Well, you're an achiever. You stuck with it and learned the new stuff.
You know, there's so much to know, and I think has been fascinating watching how medicine has evolved. And I think I told you earlier, the 2 drugs I thought of the decade were first for Rh negative mothers. You know, we watch so many patients, so many babies die, so many mothers, you know, just lose fetuses after fetuses. So that to me was a phenomenal drug to see come out. And of course,